Today, we're going to go from zero to hero on the topic of wave shaping. So, wave shaping is a type of distortion, but before we talk about that, let's talk about what audio actually is in a digital environment. So we have here a beautiful sine wave, sounds like that, and if we zoom in on it, if we zoom in really, really far, you can see that it's made up out of all of these dots, and these are called samples, and you might have heard of sample rate and bit depth, and those kind of relate to what these dots visually represent, but that's not important right now. It's just important to know that it's just a bunch of points that happen over time, and those points can have positive values like over here and negative values like over here. So what wave shaping does is it takes all of those points and it maps them onto an input-output function. Now, that is just a fancy way of saying, hey, for every input dot, we're going to put that on this x-axis over here. So the louder points that are going to be like closer to the peak of the waveform are going to be over here, and the quieter points are going to be closer to the zero crossing are going to be over here, right? And that way, all of these samples, we can map those onto the x-axis. Now, if we go up from the x-axis to any if we go up to this curve over here, right now it's just a straight line, but if we go up to the curve, we see that the curve will tell us a corresponding y value. Now, because we have a perfectly diagonal line right here, every value on the y-axis is going to be the same as on the x-axis. But we can do all sorts of crazy things here and add all these points, and now we can see that the value on the x-axis may give us a very, very different value on the y-axis. And the result is, of course, a very, very different sound. So let's take kind of a simple example. With this sine wave, we're going to look at the shape of the wave with this signal analyzer here. I'm going to start to introduce this point here, which I'm going to drag further and further to the left. And you can hear the further to the left I go, the more it starts to sound and look visually like a square wave. And you can kind of see how that relates to the shape of this graph, right? Because effectively what this graph is telling us, like, hey, every sample that is louder than minus 18 dB gets mapped to 0 dB, right? And this is still diagonal, so there's no distortion happening here on this portion of the x-axis, but as soon as it gets louder than this, we start to cut it off and we all bring it to the same level. So that's one way you can use wave shaping to imitate hard clipping. So hard clipping is what happens when on the master channel your meters go in the red. We can even try to do that right here. It might get a bit loud, but you'll have to forgive me for that. Yeah, it sounds the same pretty much. Let's set that back to something more pleasant. So this plugin I'm using right here is a free plugin called Waveshaper. It gives you a lot of flexibility, but we don't necessarily need that. There's one more thing that you should know, and that is that you can see that the wave has a positive side that's like happening over here and a negative side that's happening over here. Now, right now, we don't really see a positive and a negative side, and that's because we're doing symmetric wave shaping, which is where you treat the positive side and the negative side in the same way. We can also do asymmetric wave shaping. So when we change it to this, the curve, you have to interpret it a little bit differently. You can see here 0% and 0%. This means like absolute silence. This means the positive value that's all the way up here, and this means a negative value that's all the way, all the way down here. So this way we can change the shape of the waveform differently for the top half than for the bottom half. You have to be careful though with asymmetric wave shaping because it can introduce some DC offset. So it's best to use a DC filter or a high-pass filter after you do this. So yeah, there's tons of plugins you can use to do wave shaping. For example, Ableton's own saturator. You can see it gives you this this nice curve. It's not like in this plugin where we can totally customize it, but it has some nice preset curves that we can use to get all different flavors of distortion. And as for what these sound like, that's kind of difficult to interpret, but one rule of thumb is that if you have sort of soft curves like this, the harmonics tend to not go up as high than as if you when you have really hard, sharp angles. You can kind of imagine how that works too, because if you get a very sharp angle like this, you get something that's kind of like a square wave, and a square wave has harmonics that go all the way up. So yeah, you can use all these different algorithms basically, and they all have a very different sound. This one's quite interesting because you can see that we effectively start to fold the wave back in on itself. And you can kind of hear how it sounds almost like it's pitch shifting to 1 octave higher when I turn it up. You can even look at what it does exactly. Yeah, you can. It's very close to being 1 octave up. It's not quite, but it's close enough to fool you like that. Another plugin you can use is Searham's Distortion. All sorts of cool algorithms. So at this point, you might be thinking, okay, cool. I can use wave shaping to turn sine waves into square waves and other types of waveforms. Excuse me. So you might try this on a signal that's a bit more complex than a sine wave. Let's graduate to 2 sine waves. Didn't choose the most pleasant interval, but that's not important. We're going to chuck a saturator on it, and we're going to do, let's say, the digital clip, so we can kind of turn these 2 sine waves into 2 square waves. And it sounds nothing like 2 square waves playing together. And this is unfortunately where things get a bit complicated, because you can see that the 2 sine waves kind of make an interesting, a funny pattern when they're together like this. And because of that, the distortion is going to kind of respond in a less predictable way. So you can also see that when you start to turn this up, there's a lot of stuff that's happening down below where the original 2 sine waves are. So for this reason, it is borderline impossible to tell you what a given wave shape is going to do, because it really depends on the input as well. However, there are some principles that apply, and if you use an algorithm, over the course of producing many songs, you'll eventually sort of get a feel for what it will do to a sound, and you build up sort of an intuitive understanding of how you can use it. So with that out of the way, I think I've covered pretty much everything I wanted to say for today. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. I'll be quick to respond. And also join my Discord server. I'm dumping samples in there, all sorts of good stuff. Leave a like, subscribe. Thank you very much for watching. Cheers out. Bye-bye.